Oke, kembali lagi ke reading session dengan saya untuk The Entangled Brain. Masih ada beberapa chapter yang perlu diselesaikan, ya. Waduh, dulu. So, in the past chapters, I counted several brain areas, some of their functions, but what except is an area. Our brain areas are more or less linked, like discrete computational units that have no finite functions. Because this situation is so central to our understanding of the brain, we need to slow down here and discuss it in a greater depth. We will see that the idea of the one area, one function largely hinges on assuming a brain organization that is a modular in a sense. In contrast, if a given area is always involved in multiple functions, as advocated throughout the book, how should we revise our thinking? The subchapter will be titled Tan. When Tan was admitted to the hospital at the age of 21, he had lost the use of speeches from time. He could no longer pronounce more than a single syllable. Whenever a question was asked, he would always reply Tan, accompanied by varied expressive gestures. In fact, throughout the hospital, he was known only by his nickname Tan. Despite his impediment at the time of admission, he was perfectly able-bodied and intelligent and appeared to comprehend almost everything that was said to him. In Brazilian Portuguese, tantan is colloquially and pejoratively used to denote someone who is crazy. I wonder if the origin has something to do with Tan's predicament. In 12 April 1861, about 10 years after his initial admission and rapidly deteriorating in health, Tan was seen by Paul Broca, a surgeon with an unusual background. He was one of the founders of the field of anthropology and frame. 5 days later, Tan would die of severe case of gangrene. The brain was removed and preserved in a fixation plate that made the tissue harden with time. Based on his examination, Broca concluded that Tan's brain deficit was due to a lesion of the left frontal lobe. Broca concluded his short case report published in the Bulletin de la Société Anthropologique, a mid-page and a half in length, with the following momentous conclusion. All this permits, however, the belief that in the present case, the lesion of the frontal lobe was the cause of the loss of speech. More than 150 years later, Broca's report is the most important paper in the history of the brain function localization. Jadi ini adalah salah satu peristiwa di mana adanya brokas area yang di bagian kanan temporal, kanan atau kiri? Bagian kanan brokas. Kiri, bagian kiri ya, bagian kiri agak depan, lobe ya. Jadi di situ ada namanya brokas area, sebelahan dengan Wernicke's area yang berhubungan dengan speech, loss of speech. Itu. Nah, ini penemuan awalnya 150 tahun ya. Nah, sekarang Anda tambah lagi, discovering the function of brain areas. Historically, lesions have played a major role in trying to infer the function of human parts. Ini pentingnya. Jadi, kebanyakan modularity dari brain itu disebabkan oleh lesion. Jadi, orang menemukan ada lesion bagian ini, terus kemudian behavior dari salah satu orang tersebut itu hilang. Sehingga mostly conclude by this experiment, those scientific finding, bahwa kalau ada lesion itu ada yang hilang dari behavior itu, sehingga behavior itu berada di bagian situ. Two types of lesion has been considered. In human, naturally occurring damage from tumor or vascular accidents. In animals, more precisely, the lesion produced surgically. Broca's paper, capitalizing on the first type of injury, catapulted forward that idea of that a mental function can be indeed be localized. At the time, very little was known about how the convoluted mass of gray and white matter inside the head sparked mental faculties. Consider that Boca's observation took place not long after the heyday of the much maligned phrenology movement exposed by Frankel and his disciples, which was particularly influential between 810 and 1840. Phrenologists would observe and feel that school of individuals determine their psychological propensities such as philoprogenitiveness, that is, the love of offspring or children in general, which was located centrally at the back of the head, more or less where we know the visual cortex to be. Ini tentang visual cortex, bagian belakang. Kemudian, an early series of lesion studies in animal was performed by Edward Hisek Staffridge and the dogs published in 1870. Hisek was a psychiatrist interested in the potential application of electrical currents to ameliorate certain medical conditions. By the mid-1860s, he had developed an apparatus to deliver electrical stimulation to human patients and observed that current applied to the back of the patient had reliably elicited pain movements, prompting him to investigate the use of the technique as called galvanization. Further, his citizen father wishes an anatomist to join him in studies to be conducted in dogs. Their most famous experiment was performed not in a well-equipped university laboratory but an dressing table in the bedroom of his house in Berlin. Initially, they electrically stimulated the canine cortex with weak electrical currents. By systematically varying the site that was cited, they uncovered locations that elicited muscular responses of the forepaw, hindpaw, face, and neck. In all cases, on the side of body opposite of to the stimulation, also called contralateral side, the scalpel, they then remove the area that led to say forepaw movement and even galvanization. Although they did not abolish all movement from the contralateral plow, movement was impaired. Abnormal posture was observed. Notably, sensation appeared to be normal as the animal's response to the stimuli went unaltered. That is to say that observed deficit caused by the lesion was relatively selective for motor production, and not a sensory perception, and it was linked to a specific body part. The importance of the study by his entries, like the observation by Broca, cannot be overestimated. This was a match due to their result as to their conclusions based on combining electrical stimulation and lesion, as immodestly stated by them. Some psychological function, and perhaps all of them in order to enter matter or originate from it, need circumscribed centers of the cortex. That is to say, according to them, the cortex contained a processing center. His research suggested that it would be worthwhile for researchers to search for areas considered with sensation and even regions evolved with intelligence. At the time, was right as location where mental function resides. Oke, jadi di sini fokusnya ternyata ada motor cortex yang ditemukan menggunakan bagian sini. Oke. Oke, kita lanjut lagi ke bagian dissociating mental function. It is definitely possible to study brain at its most elementary sense. Mechanism of neurospike and signal propagation are axons, molecular mechanism along the gap or synapse between neurons or so on. Jadi setelah melakukan praktik tersebut, nah ini mulai ada possible nih. Kalau kita bisa pakai menggunakan mekanisme neural spike generation. But often one studies brain mechanism, even the most basic ones, to understand the neural basis of mental functions, seeing a sunset, hearing a screech, speaking a sentence, remembering a childhood memory, feeling a certain about situation. A shift goal in the science of the mind and brain to is to explicitly unravel the functional architecture of the mind to identify and characterize the mental processes underlying behavior. But mental processes are not directly observable. Rather, their existence must be inferred from external manifestation, what we call overt behaviors. Insight into mental functions can begin based on the byproducts of brain damage and carefully chosen tasks, much like approach to drug and of its second place, involves some the existence of and general controls of mental processes are then inferred from the manner in which the performance change from manipulation to manipulation, involving different level of experimental variable and different forms of brain damage. In trying to delineate mental processes, clinicians are extremely valuable even to cognitive scientists not inherently interested in the brain. The reason is the disturbances in behavior performance when the brain is damaged can inform us about the organization of the mind. Okay, this is a bit a key. For example, to what extent is the processing of verbs and nouns varied? If one uncovered the method affect the processing of words used as verbs, say he judged, more than of the same words as used as noun, say the judges. This would be extremely valuable in outlining the organization of the mental processes in question. What was called the functional oxidator above. To infer existence of spirit mental processes, researchers rely on the logic of disassociation. Consider first a single disassociation let A and B to be two tasks, say one involving verbs, another involving noun. Let M to be manipulation. A single disassociation is observed if M affects performance on a B but not on a B. On a but not on B. The manipulation could correspond to a lesion of a region, and this association will be established if the damage impair performance of A but not B. In all, this association implies the inference that there is an underlying mental function required by A but not by B. The logic of this association is central to neuroscience has been used to localize mental function. Ini menggunakan disasosiasi, jadi kalau dikasih A ternyata ada performan di situ, tapi tidak di B berarti ada hubungannya dengan A, sehingga tidak butuh B. Gitu. The reasoning is analogous to what one would adopt to reverse engineer in human-made devices. Remove this piston in a car to be discovered there are key elements in the combustion processes that power standard automobile, but single dissociation are inherently weak, and although they were frequently employed in research in the first decades of the 20th century and in many ways after that, in the 1950s, investigators started to question the single dissociation application. For example, in some cases, it may well be that general differences following a lesion could explain the pattern of result. Perhaps the lesion impairs most tasks that are difficult, and task A happens to be harder than task B. Evidently, better experimental design and methodology with careful choice of task A and B and the dimension along which A and B are matched ameliorate the problems with question function. This is simply good experimental design which is cornerstone of solid experimental science. After all, if it's observed in the one experimental condition, the question as was relative to what control conditions are fundamental. Okay, good. Sih. Cuman eh, ada ini masalah di sini, ada challenge di situ relatif to what itu ya. What do brainarians do? In drawing connection between inference developers in trying to establish the analytical underpinnings of mental function, this single disassociation strategy is simply too weak. The inconclusiveness of methodology motivates the double disassociate logic. Just see a picture 4.9. A single disassociation is observed in region 1 if a performance on task A but non task B. A double dissociation is observed if, in addition, region 2 have a performance on B but not A. But singular and double dissociation indicate that there is underlying meta function required by A but not by B. In addition, a double dissociation implies more converse inference, namely that there is underlying meta function required by task B but not by task A. In addition, it is surmised that pre-regions 1 and 2 carry out functions that are relatively isolable from each other. The power of double dissociation logic lies in a specific relation in logic 1 and 2 does not simply cause of series impairments. Instead, the impaired circumstance function. Gitu. Ini the double decision logic. If mental person A is effective relation region 1 but not region 2 and vice versa for mental B, we said they are doubly dissociated. Many researchers, but not all, responded to this area and be functionally specialized. Sama fungsi itu memang spesialis. What the double dissociation what do double dissociation tell us? In humans, before the advent of modern neuroimaging techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, researchers tried to uncover function by studying impaired and preserve abilities in brain imaged persons. And the most powerful weapon in the neuropsychologist's armamentarium was double session approaches described. Here, specific example, out of neurologically intact person have no difficulty pronouncing written words regardless of whether they have a concrete meaning, say table, or abstract meaning, say truth. After a severe language stroke, patient PV correctly pronounced 67% of concrete words, but only 30% of abstract words. The findings that concrete and abstract were differently susceptible to damage suggests that they are represented spirit in the neural tissue. An alternative view, however, is that PV's brain damage affected concrete and abstract representation equally, but that abstract words were more impaired because they are inherently more difficult to pronounce. On this latter account, one would not expect to see the opposite relationship, better reading of abstract than concrete words following brain damage. This is actually what neurophysiologist Elizabeth Wellington observed in pasien CFE who had left his muscle tumor. He read correctly 36% of concrete work but 55% of trouble. Together, patient PV and CFE exemplify a double situation of concrete and abstract reading. Although both lesions were in the brain left hemisphere, they were assumed to compromise different parts of the cortex. Moreover, the behavioral impairments of PV and CFE were observed in the older patients too. Double dissociation among brain damaged patients, as well as animal with vocalization, who have been identified for many pairs of tasks, planning, perception, action, emotional motivation. To exemplify the typical interpretation of this form of relationships, consider the conclusion by Warrington herself, a hugely influential scientist, that the only plausible interpretation of double dissociation between abstract word deficit and the concrete word deficit is the functional and structural conjugation of semantic representation of words in categorical. That is to say, the semantic of concrete words and those of abstract words must be implemented separately. They rely on different functional and are carried out in disparate parts of the brain. The reasoning support this interpretation dovetails nicely with the view that mental functions rely on a collection of relatively independent processing components or modulars. It's dedicated to perform empathical function, which is a view embraced by many influential researchers. In fact, double dissociation and modularity go together so naturally that the theoretical perspective of modularity has to meet several subgroups of neuroscience. As another neuroscientist, Andrew Ellis put it, there can be no argument with the fact of modularity, only about its nature and extent. So, what is the modularity? So, how isable are parts of the brain? Modularity can be conceptualized in multiple ways. And one, two parts A and B of a system are defined as modules if and only if they are separatably modifiable. Modular second, the process carried out in the subsystem are semi-modifiable, computes a particular type of input and output mapping. Modular three, there exists a decomposition of the system such that the computational interaction within subsystem are much more complex than those between subsystems. And model four, subsystem form two into complex network with other subsystems so that each is carrying out only particular subfunction of a much more complex overall system. And five, the subsystem need to be relatively specialized in the brain. Okay. Property M1 provides a generic description idea. Jadi idea utamanya itu ada di M1. Kemudian M2 further specifies that some input-output relationships should be computed by the module in question. But what are modules? They are fairly well delimited parts, say Brodmann area 17 in the back of the brain corresponding to the primary visual cortex. But acknowledging that modules may inform more than just single area, property in 3 tries to capture a less restrictive notion of modality, where one can think of such a system themselves perhaps composed of more elementary components that are relatively encapsulated from their other subsystems. Property M4 goes a step further, admitting that subsystems themselves are fairly complex and might interact with other subsystems. Still, being a subsystem, it should be compute an identifiable elementary function. Properties M1 to M4 are general and could apply in any system, natural or human-made. Property M5 is specific to the brain. Of course, is a key to how the notion is conceptualized in neuroscience. Unless some version of property M5 holds, the system would not be recognized and modular. For example, it's possible imagine brain most function follow properties M1 to 4, but strictly implemented in special discrete definition. Imagine the visual brain yet to be produced. Incidentally, philosophers and computer scientists love to concoct all sorts of the changing possibilities. In such case, the system will be functional modular, but not in terms of instantiated in physical medium. It is useful to recognize movie in terms of composability. A composable system is one of which a subsystem does its job independently of others. Okay. In contrast, non-sequential system, the component are so interrelated to divide and to break them. What kind of system is the brain where alarms between combustible to decombustible reside? The question is not either armchair and museum. It is a core of our strategy to investigate architecture in the main brain. Even more so, because we must confront head on the following question. Are there kinds of wisdom for which a reductionistic analysis, that is, one in terms of simpler components, would fail? Here, reductionism means the type of approach is central to science, in which an organization greater complexity is understood in terms of contribution of subparts, which then put together give rise to the behavior in the broader system. To be sure, posing a question in this manner might sound counterintuitive to the readers, and it's like customer to success mechanistic analysis, the very bedrock of science. Indeed, reduction is the declared philosophy of most scientists. Really separate into the smallest part, determine their properties, and you explain the whole system. It is like physics. As developed through the world, I believe such approach provides best at improve impoverished description of brain function, as most of explanatory work needs to be done at the level of interaction. Unfortunately, neuroscience as discipline is all too reductionist, but rigid philosophy of reduction is not an act of scientific analysis. That is the conversion into parts and the analysis and the economic embraces some specific Taoism as the band is may sometimes held as the Darwin in the 20th century. No processes can be understood except through careful analysis. However, the interaction of the components must be considered as much as the properties of the isolated components. We will have a lot more to say in this issue in the chapter 8 discussing complex system. Okay, let's go there to the one area, one function. Let's go back to brain areas and consider once more the relationship to mental process. We start the simplest formation, namely by assuming to one mapping between area and its function. We are assuming for the moment that we can come up with and agree on a set criteria that defines what an area is. Maybe it's what Roman defined early in the 20th century, or perhaps it is defined the reason proposal discussed in chapter 1. For example, we could say that the function of the primary visual context is a visual perception of the more basic visual mechanism such as detecting age, sharp line to detect transition in the image. The same type of description can be applied to other sensory, auditory, olfactory, and so on, and motor areas of the brain. This exercise becomes considerably less straightforward for the brain areas that are not sensory or motor, as their working becomes much more difficult to determine and describe. Nevertheless, in theory, we can imagine extending the idea to all parts of the brain. The result of this endeavor will be a list of area function pairs. Just like this himpunan L ya, jadi himpunan L ada berbagai macam, where areas A implement function F. To the date, no such list has been systematically generated. However, current knowledge indicates that this strategy will not yield a simple area function list. What may start a simple for a pair of area and function. As Teresa forgets, gradually is revised and grows to include a list of functions as area, but when necessary function F1, F2, Ft. Teresa proposes that area implements a specific function as additional studies accumulate, we come to see that area participates in multiple functions. In other words, for a basic one-to-one A1 to the function 1, area 1 ke fungsi 1 mapping, the features F4 to one-to-many mapping. Figure 4 to many to one mapping, many to many. Consider example starting 1960 lesion study of a monkey suggested that the prevalent claim working memory such as the ability to complement and amount phone number for several seconds because dialing it. As they focus on this part of the brain and art, the list of function grew to many cognitive operation and the prevalent becomes central to our understanding what is called executive function. See chapter 7. In fact, today the list is not limited to cognitive processes, but includes contribution to emotion and motivation. The prevalent context is thus multifaceted. One may object that a sector is too large and that is naturally will be expected to participate in multiple processes. While this is valid interjection, the argument holds a small areas too. For example, take the amygdala, a region often associated with highly negative of aversive information. However, the amygdala also participate in the processing of appetite items, and this multifunctionality applies even to amygdala subnuclei. Let's consider social function mapping further from the previous mental function. Where is the brain is given function F carried out? An experiment of with functional MRI, tasks and impulse cognitive challenge engage multiple areas of the frontal and parietal cortex. Example, the task requiring participants to selectively pay attention to certain stimuli among many and many questions, answer questions about the ones that are relevant. In a screen containing blue and red objects, are there more rectangles or circles that are blue? These regions are important for paying attention and selecting information that might be further interrogated. Such attentional control regions are observed in the circumscribed sectors of the frontal and parietal cortex. Thus, multiple individual regions are capable to carrying out of mental function and instance of many-to-one mapping. The explicit use of "or" here indicates that, say, A1 is capable of implementing F1, but so are A2 and so on. Now, together, if brain regions is perceived in many functions and which can be carried out by many brain regions, the instances of function might be many to many. Needless to say, the study system with this proposal is considerably more challenging than the system with one-to-one organization or related care. Consider a situation where a gene contributes to many traits of physiological processes. Conversely, trait or physiological processes depend on the license of genes. Social function in relationship can be defined at multiple levels from the precise, for instance, primary precise consent to detect the object progress to the abstract, for instance, primary consent is concerned of visual perception. Accordingly, social function relationship will depend on the granularity in question. Some researchers have suggested that at some level of this description, brain region does not have more than one function at the proper one. It will have a single function, price, and Princeton 2005. In contrast, a central idea developed in this book is that the one-to-one framework, even in implicitly accepted or adopted by neuroscientists, is an oversimplification and hampers progress in understanding the mind and the brain. Brain areas are multifaceted. If the brain area don't implement single process, how should we characterize them? Instead of focusing single summary function, it's better to describe an area functional repertoire across a possibly large range of functions. To what extent does the area participate in each of them? No consensus has measured about how to do this, but below we'll discuss some early results. The basic idea is simple too. For example, coffee growers around the world think of flower the same way. As a flower profile of palette, Brazil coffee is popular because very good quality and not even the acidity to mention three attributes. They start with the animal uses condition goes into fire stimuli. The voice meticulous and painstaking because until recently the vast majority of studies are recorded from a single or a very few electrodes in a single brain area. Setting up project, a researcher to decide what purposes processes to investigate and what precise location, for example, probing classical condition in the amygdala. Having elected to do so, the electrode is inserted in a multiple network sites as investigators determine the response characteristic of the cells in the area. Newer technique exists where creates a finely spaced electrodes can record from adjacent cells simultaneously. See Chapter 12 for some regions. Researchers have categorized cells respond to perceived for decades. Considering the broader published literature, those allows them to have a fairly comprehensive view. In particular, the work of mapping cell responses has been a mainstay of perception and action research. Given that the stimulates variables of interest can be manipulated systematically, it is easy to precisely change the physical properties of visual stimuli. For example, in this manner, the visual properties of cell across more than dozen areas in the capital and temporal cortex have been studied, and several parietal and frontal cortex have been explored to determine neural responses during preparation and elicitation of movement. It is thus possible to manage the proportion of the functional cell types in the brain region. Consider, for example, the brain region, the visual cortex V4, visual number 4, and empty from the middle temporal lobe, approximately 85% of cells in the area of middle temporal lobe shows preference from the direction stimulus is moving. They respond more vigorously to the rightward versus leftward motion, say, whereas only 5% of cells in the prefer to do so. In contrast, 50% of the cells in the area prefer have strong preference to the wavelength of the visual stimuli related to stimulus color, whereas most cells are empty appear to do so. Finally, 75% of the cell empty are tuned into the orientation of the visual stimulus. There is a angle between the Maya elimination and of a stimulus and a horizontal line. And 50% of the cells in area V4 do so too. If we call these three properties DS, OS, and OS for stimulation, wavelength orientation, respectively, we can summarize area response by triplets JS, WS, WS, and OS, such as MT can be described by 0.85, 0.75, and rectifier by 0.05, 0.5, and 0.50, as shown as figure 4.3. This type of summary description can be gently very rich and immediately shift the focus from thinking region computes X to the this region participants in the multiple processes. At the same time, the approach prompts us to consider several tone equations. In this way, only three dimensions were used, each of which related the attribute of the relevant related computing and object's movement, color, and shape, respectively. But based on these three features, sure, we can add property. There's no guarantee that will be cover all the important ones. In fact, at a given point in time, the attributes more likely reflect our research know and likely find interesting. This is one reason the framework become increasingly difficult for the brain areas that are not chiefly sensory or motor, whereas sensory motor attributes may be more intuitive, cognitive, and emotional and motivation elements are much less so. In fact, they're constantly debated by researchers. So, what set to a properties should be considered for the regions of the prefrontal cortex that are involved in an array of mental processes? Okay. More fundamentally, we should have known that have a good way of placing an appropriate space of functions. Is the small set of functions that is made of augmentation or mental function are phonemes in language. English was as approximately 42 phonemes, the basic sound that make up spoken word. Are there 42 functions that define the entire space of mental process? However, 42 although we don't have answers to this fundamental question, some form of multifunction depends on the future of area capability is needed. A single function capacity is straitjacket that needs to be shared for readers with a mathematical functionality to basic element like phonemes expresses satisfied subspace. In linear algebra, specific function that can be used to represent arbitrary signal like a pair of well-flat analysis. The multifunction approach can be illustrated by considering human neuromatrices, including functional MRI. Despite the obvious limitation imposed by studying participants lying on the bed, many people feel sleepy and may even momentarily doze off, not to mention that we can't ask them to walk around and produce behavior. The ability to probe of the brain universally and harmlessly means that they can scrutinize a staggering range of mental processes, from perception and action to problem-solving and morality. With the growth of this literature, which accelerated in earnest after publication of the first functional MRI studies, several data repositories have been created and combined the result of thousands of studies in a single place. In my laboratory, we can capitalize this treasure trove to the characterize functional profile of region across the brain, which is 20 times too much. So this that encompass a broad range of mental processes, including those linked up perception, action, motion, and cognition. They consider the entire database of available published studies at each brain location. We create 20-dimensional function prescription indicating the relative degree of engagement of each of 20 domains attributes. Essentially, we counted the number of times activation was reported in the brain equation, not in task domain equation. For example, a study reported strong response during a language task relative to control task would not count toward the language domain as a report equation. We found that brains are rather functionally diverse and engaged in tasks across many domains, but this didn't mean they respond uniformly. They have preferences, which are time-small components. To understand how multifunctionally vary across the brain, we compute a mission that summarizes functionally diversity. A brain region engaged by tasks across multiple domains will have diversity, whereas those engaged by tasks in only a few domains will have low diversity. Function diversity across the brain, with some brain regions being recruited with very specific or experimental condition. The findings summarized in the figure of 4.4 paint a picture of brain as functional diverse, each with a textile computation. The goal was here to illustrate the multi-dimensional approach rather than present a more definitive picture. For one, conclusions were entirely based on a single technique, which has relatively low spatial resolution. In functional MRI, single at each location pulled together, processing relative to very large number of neurons, a typical location can foxel can easily contains millions of neurons. The approach doesn't account for the confusion bias represented in the literature. For example, researchers often associate mental activation with emotion and are thus more likely to publish results reflecting this association, a tendency that will increase the association between the amygdala and the domain emotion. The emotion and feeling may be in different things when they say emotion. Finally, the mixed study of the essential 20-dimensional space of mental tasks as reasonable decomposition. Many other breakdowns are possible, of course, and might be even more informative to consider collection of them at the same time. This will be like describing coffee in terms of given a set of attributes, but then using squared group of attributes. So, how should we think about brain areas? So, science has acknowledged of this question since the modernizations of the last few decades of 19th century, as was purposely summarized by Palmer Hogan when describing the difficulty inherent in visualizing or even conceptualizing a classification of neurons with the bilateral cortical subcortical structures and so on. Integrated into functional unit. It refers to an anatomically spread integrated center of system. In other words, if not constrained to a spatially delimited area, then what? Whereas science has proved exceedingly apt at describing modular systems, such as many foreign engineering, it has not made as much progress when the update study is not clearly decomposable. This is the case when both processes and genetics that both are within the realm of biology is not surprising, as biology has properties that are fairly unique and distinguished from the physical science. The ideas charted in this chapter have implication to how we'll describe brain regions in the remainder of the book. At first, we feel the important function may be held at brain regions will because mostly on their own. This is definitely didactically. At times, therefore, it will be appear as if the regions themselves are responsible for the function or behavior described. Instead, the reader should bear in mind that brain regions participate in the specific computation function process behaviors only when embedded within larger circuits compress the multiple brain areas. Therefore, our understanding of the role of specific region needs to be gradually bootstrapped so that eventually we will have a better appreciation for its functional contributions and repertoire as we gain insight into how it interacts with other regions. Oke, bagian dua ini masih sama tentang modularity, namun dalam tataran yang lebih kompleks lagi. Di situ disebutkan bahwa mana gambarnya? Oke, bahwa bisa berarti banyak hal. Bisa jadi satu area berfungsi terhadap satu hal, bisa jadi satu area itu memiliki fungsi beberapa hal, bisa jadi mungkin beberapa hal yang terlihat itu diwujudkan oleh beberapa hal sebelumnya, gitu. Dan yang bagian D, beberapa hal itu muncul akibat instruksi sebelumnya. Dan dia tidak bergantung dengan lokasi area yang mana. Begitu. Oke, ini adalah bagian keempat. Ini dulu kita lanjutkan lagi di video selanjutnya. Terima kasih. Ini kita baca masih tetap buku The Entangled Brain How Perception and etc. Okay, thank you. Bye.